As is our practice, and the enormous generosity of our Secretary General in offering his time, let alone his stamina, we are now going to enter a Q&A session with the Secretary General, which I know we all find very helpful. However, I have 11 groups of 3 each to ask questions. And if you use that time to pontificate, we will not get through every question. So I plead with everyone to use their most concise method of asking a question so that we can maximize this time together. And I know you will. Thank you. So the first group, Adjao Silva, the head of the Portuguese delegation, Mimi Kadeli, head of the Albanian delegation, and Karl Lammerts, the head of the German delegation. Mr. Silva, you have the floor.
Thank you.
There are microphones where, on the side, if you will go up to a microphone, that way we can hear you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Secretary General. Vou passar a falar em português.
I will continue in Portuguese.
Senhor Presidente da Assembleia da República,
Mr. Speaker of the Portuguese Parliament, Madam Speaker of the House of Representatives, dear colleagues, I would first like to welcome you all and to thank Mr. Secretary General for his presence, and now talking about the revision of the strategic concept. The last revision took place in Lisbon in 2010. Today we face new threats and new challenges. This issue about strategic concept has been at the core of our debates, of our discussions, lively debates, and within this strategic revision there is the issue of the transatlantic relationship. The Secretary General already mentioned that, the transatlantic relationship, but my question is, if this transatlantic relationship, which is crucial since the Washington Treaty 72 years ago, will it remain strong and essential to NATO's organization, or otherwise it will be weakened in the coming times? Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Adjao.
Chairman.
Mimi Kadeli. Mimi?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Dear Secretary General, good to see you and have you back. Thank you for being here. Dear colleagues. Well, first of all, I would like to honor and pay tribute to all soldiers, personnel and civilians, both from NATO members and from Afghanistan, who served with dedication, sacrificing their blood and lives during our engagement in Afghanistan. Considering the need for a deep reflection over the reasons of the falling back of the country and the lessons we have to draw from that, my mind goes to our other missions around the world, and more specifically about the one we have right in Europe since more than 20 years, named KFOR, which continues to ensure a safe, secure environment, not only in the Western Balkans. At this point, recalling the ultimatum of that Serbian president has recently given to NATO, 24 hours to intervene in case Serbs of Kosovo are threatened before Serbia reacts against its neighboring country, my question would be, what KFOR mission would be in order to seal the peace in the country and prevent it from any threat, including similar to the one intended by me above ultimatum, before it withdraws?
Thank you. Thank you, Mimi. and Karl Lammers, head of the German delegation. Karl. Karl?
General, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much, dear Secretary General, for your great work over the past years, and especially during these difficult times. And thank you very much for the trustful cooperation over the last years. The development of the new strategic concept you mentioned will dominate discussions in the coming months. The last summit communique speaks of systemic challenges and competition. My question is, what role can NATO as a defense alliance play in the confrontation with authoritarian regimes and countries like Russia and China? What new aspects must the future strategic concept take up? Thank you.
Thank you, Karl. Mr. Secretary General.
Thank you so much. First, to the question from Mr. Silva on the strategic concept. Well, also the current strategic concept is called the Lisbon strategic concept. The next one will be called the Madrid strategic concept. So that's a huge difference, because we're going to adapt the next one at the summit in Madrid. But there will be also other changes, because I think that it is so obvious that so much has happened since we agreed the the Lisbon strategic concept back in 2010 in Lisbon. If we read the current strategic concept, which has served us well, we are still writing about or addressing Russia as a potential strategic partner. That was before Ukraine. We hardly mention climate change at all. China is not mentioned with a single word. So, of course, the world has totally changed. We see a much more aggressive Russia, not a strategic partner. Climate change is now on the top of the NATO agenda because it matters for our security. And we see the global balance of power really shifting with the rise of China. These are examples of issues we have to address in the new strategic concept. Then you asked about whether I'm afraid that we will see a weakening of the transatlantic relationship. No, I don't think so. Actually, I am fundamentally an optimist, because I think that if anything, all these changes, the fact that we are faced with more state-to-state rivalry, that we have global competition, makes NATO more important, because we face bigger and more unpredictable security challenges. And therefore, it's obvious for Europe that we need to stand together with North America. But Speaker Pelosi and others from the United States can tell you perhaps that actually in the United States, there is increased support for NATO, a very strong bipartisan support, not least because my feeling is that the United States, they understand that when they see the rise of China, when you see more global competition, then it's very good to have friends. And the United States have 29 friends and allies in NATO, and that is something no other major power has. So I believe that the transatlantic bond is even more needed now, and that's the reason why, despite differences on some issues, allies will be able to strengthen that bond over the Atlantic. Then to Mimi Kodeli, first of all, it's always great to see you again. You asked me on Afghan, not on KFOR, about KFOR. Well, KFOR will stay, and KFOR plays a very important role in Kosovo, helping not only to keep a safe and secure environment and stability in Kosovo, but also in the broader region by stabilizing Kosovo. And we will, of course, do what we believe is needed according to our mandate, meaning, for instance, that we work very closely with the European Union. We saw some tensions increasing about around some border crossings and related some new requirements on licensing of also plates for cars. That issue was possible to solve because we had NATO troops, KFOR troops deployed at the border crossings, working together with the EU diplomats. And for me, KFOR is a perfect example on how EU and NATO can work together in addressing a challenge as we face them in Kosovo. Then, Carl Lammers, you asked me about the strategic concept. Well, I already, in a way, addressed that. I think that the strategic concept, first of all, it is important to have a new strategic concept. But in one way, it's even more important the process that leads up to that strategic concept. Because we need a discussion, we need a real engagement from all capitals, and that's my plan to organize that. So we develop a common understanding on the new security threats and challenges we face. And by developing that common understanding, we are strengthening the unity of this alliance. So the good thing with the strategic concept is not only the language that we finally agree, but the process leading up to that language. So I am looking forward to continue to engage with this assembly as we develop the strategic concept.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I want to congratulate our first three questioners for watching time. Next three questioners, Osman Bak, I think I see Osman there, yeah, from Turkey. Udeki Lune, head of the Estonian delegation, and Ojars Eriks Kalnins, head of the Latvian delegation. Osman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. As you know, Turkey and Russia signed a memorandum for the building of no-conflict zone in Idlib province of Syria in 2017. The main idea behind the memorandum was to cope with humanitarian crisis in the region and ensure the continuance of ceasefire. Until now, Turkey did its best to ensure the ceasefire is respected. But recently, new developments are on the way in the province of Syria that might affect Turkey, Europe, and our allies. Syrian regime and Russia are turning up the pressure against the civilians in Idlib by continuous campaign of shelling and airstrikes. Idlib is home to approximately 4 million Syrians, and once the truce is broken, they will start flowing to Turkey and Europe. We will witness a new chapter of humanitarian crisis. My question is what our alliance can do to stop Syrian regime and Russia in Idlib. As you know, Turkey has 4 million Syrian refugees, and after Afghanistan developments, we will have another flow of refugees. So that's why we need support from our allies. Thank you.
Thank you, Osman. Good job in staying in time. Udeki. Where are you?
Oops. Does it? Thank you.
Okay.
Dear Secretary General, thank you for your most interesting speech. And my question relates to the topic that has been extensively discussed here in the past days, namely our future, the revision of NATO's strategic concept. First, I want to stress that NATO is extremely strong and effective on its solid ground of military security in the European theater. Its charter mandates a regional security organization based on mutual solidarity. To be sure, it's written on its very name, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We are effective because we take care of security of our own homelands. This is our democratic mandate. Ultimately, here there have been calls to step out of this chartered territory, to take more global posture, and thus act outside of this regional mandate. Mr. Secretary General, would you think that this could give a fantastic opportunity for our critics to raise against us the accusations of colonialism and imperialism? Afghanistan tells us that we are able to provide security anywhere, but we are outgunned by a single political sentence. This is not your home. So let's not ignore this bitter lesson from Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Udeki. And finally, Ojars.
Hello, Mr. Secretary General. Greetings from all your friends in Latvia. We're in the back today. We all agree that it's very important to talk about military mobility in NATO, but I think Afghanistan has demonstrated that we have no plans for civilian mobility at the end of military operations. It appears that there was no consultation between the EU and NATO before the evacuation of troops to provide for logistics and transportation for the thousands of EU civilians who were left stranded. Would you agree that the need for civilian mobility will be one of the lessons learned from operations like Afghanistan? Thank you.
Thank you, Ajars. Mr. Secretary General.
First, on Syria, also we are, of course, following the developments and everything that takes place in Syria very closely because it matters for our security. We continue to condemn both the use of violence by the Assad regime. They have used chemical weapons and also the support they receive from Russia. But as you know, NATO is not present on the ground in Syria. We support UN efforts to find a political negotiated solution. I am aware of that some NATO allies are on the ground in Syria, but NATO has so far, and NATO's approach is that we should not have a NATO mission or a NATO presence on the ground in Syria. We support the efforts of the global coalition to defeat Daesh, but without having NATO troops on the ground in Syria. Then on to Estonia. Yes, NATO is a North Atlantic alliance. And I don't think anyone has suggested that we should become a global alliance, meaning that we should open up for membership from Asia or for Africa or for Latin America. NATO, according to the Washington Treaty, consists of North America, Canada and United States, and European allies. That's it. The challenge is that this region, the North Atlantic region, we face global threats. So as a regional alliance, we need to respond to deal with global threats and challenges. There's no we can say that we're only looking at North America and Europe, because this region live in a dangerous world. And this is not something new. Terrorism has been a global threat for many, many years. And that brought NATO to Afghanistan. It started actually back in the 1990s when we had the brutal civil wars in the Balkans. It was not obvious that NATO should go out of territory, but we went out of territory in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Serbia and ended two brutal ethnic wars. And now we face other global threats. Cyber is global. Everything we see in space, which is great importance for our security, is truly global. And of course, the rise of China matters for our security. There is no way we can say that doesn't matter. We see them trying to control critical infrastructure. We see them in cyberspace. We see them in Africa. And of course, freedom of navigation, the fact that China soon will have the biggest economy in the world, are leading in many advanced disruptive technologies, investing heavily in new nuclear capabilities, are working more and more closely with Russia. All of that makes it impossible for NATO not to address the security impact of the rise of China. So I'm not arguing in favor of NATO becoming a global alliance, meaning that we should have members from all over the world and apply Article 5 from countries all over the world. But I'm arguing in favor of that as a regional alliance, we need to deal with global threats. That has been the case for many years, but even more so as we see the global balance of power is shifting.
And if, Mr. Secretary, if I could just inject, I think there's one of the points you're making. I mean, we don't live in the 19th century anymore. You have to take cognizance. That doesn't mean we directly get involved in, but taking cognizance of the developments in other parts of the world is in our interest.
Then lastly to Latvia. First of all, for me it is important to state the following. it was difficult to decide the way ahead in Afghanistan. We faced only difficult options. But this idea that we didn't consult is wrong. We had 3 ministerial meetings this spring. We had almost weekly ambassadorial meetings, meetings in different NATO committees, discussing the way ahead in Afghanistan. And all allies didn't agree on all the issues, but we consulted. Then the United States made its decision, and after that, all allies agreed that we should end our military presence in Afghanistan. So it's absolutely possible to have different views about whether that was right or wrong. But to say that we didn't consult is factually wrong. We consulted and made a difficult decision together, knowing the risks. It was stated clearly in the meetings, and I actually also stated publicly in the media, that if we leave, there is a risk that Taliban will return. The surprise was not that Taliban returned. What we didn't anticipate was the speed. But we did make that decision because we knew that the alternative to stay most likely would have meant to stay for 10, 20 more years in an open-ended military mission with more casualties of our own troops, but also civilians in Afghanistan. And most likely, we would have been forced to increase the number of troops in Afghanistan. And I will not mention names, but I know countries who were actually on their way out, regardless of the decision. And some have already left. So we were in a decision, we faced this dilemma, and we made the hard decision together. Then it was not in vain. We were able to fight terrorism for 20 years. We will continue to be vigilant and do whatever we can to prevent Afghanistan becoming a safe haven for international terrorists. And we will also, of course, support efforts by allies to preserve the gains we made when it comes to also social and economic progress in Afghanistan, and not least the fact that women should continue to get education. On the evacuation, well, I think so the last NATO troops were out of Afghanistan mid-July. We had several hundred civilians at the airport, playing a key role, air traffic controller, providing fuel, communications, running the airport, together with the United States and some other allies who were at the airport. Turkey was there, UK, Norway was operating in a hospital. So NATO allies were there, but they were not under NATO command. They were as individual allies, and NATO played a coordinating role. And of course, the fact that the collapse of Kabul happened so quickly led to the very difficult and chaotic situation in the first days. After that, it was a quite impressive airlift of citizens from NATO countries, including many of them from EU countries. So I think we actually demonstrated that we can work together, European allies, North America, US, and be able to get a lot of people out. 120,000, more than 120,000 people in such a short period is actually quite impressive.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. Group 3, Zaida Cantera from Spain, Theo Franken, Belgium, and Salima Belhaj, the new head of the Netherlands delegation. Zaida.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. El error no está en la decisión, dicen los militares. El error está en la ejecución, tal vez. Pero mi pregunta va sobre otra cuestión.
It's not about the military. We have other aspects. In warfare, you need to be able to combat the enemy without going to war in the first place. We've won the war against terror during the first years in Afghanistan, but we've lost something that is much more important. That's the narrative, the war of narrative of the message we want to translate, of our values. What does that mean? We have a profound credibility crisis within NATO. The trust that people place in us, and that is not only so in the countries like Afghanistan, where we exited, but also in the neighboring countries of Afghanistan, but also in our own countries. Thus, here comes my question. Our message from NATO to our own audiences to get their support, to neutral audiences to get their support, and vis-à-vis the enemy so that they don't go against us. How can we transmit this message that we're strong in NATO, that we have a commitment, and that we are definitely assertive and resolute? Thank you so much.
Formidable. You had 1 second left. Thank you. Theo.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary General, thank you for being here. I'll make it short. I have 2 questions. Afghanistan was not our best episode in the history of NATO. We're all agreeing on that, I think. First of all, the comeback of Taliban. Why was our intel so bad? Why was our information so bad? They took 20 months to come back and to take the capital. They took 20 days. What went wrong? Why were we not better informed? Second, when do we start a counter-terrorism operation in Afghanistan? Because Al-Qaeda is regrouping on Afghanistan soil, and we need to be ready to counter terrorism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Theo. And finally, Salima.
Dear Secretary of General Stoltenberg, on behalf of the Dutch delegation, I would like to send out a message, and we have a question. First, we are proud of all military, diplomats, civil servants, human rights activists and NGOs who helped out during an unknown crisis and evacuation, saving people, trying to guide people to the Kabul airport. I hope the Secretary General underlines the importance of appreciating those who did everything that was in their power during this evacuation. The image of all those Afghans running with the evacuation planes is an image that we can and should never forget. The desperate Afghans and the fear of terror. We need to learn from this evacuation. So now I'll come to the question a lot of colleagues have. Besides the inquiry into what went wrong and what we can learn, and underline the fact that we emphasize the importance of our NATO relationship, would it be possible to elaborate on how we must deal with the uncomfortable feeling of being left alone by ourselves as European NATO countries? Besides the fact that European NATO countries must try to learn to work together, could you already reflect on the question on what would help to continue to make the NATO relationship stronger? Thank you.
Thank you, Salima. Mr. Secretary General.
Thanks so much. They're very relevant and good questions, and you're actually very good at keeping the time limits. The problem is not the questions, the problem is the answers. They are too long. And now you all asked about Afghanistan, so I will try to, in a way, group that together to try to save a bit of time. First of all, I think it's important that we focus on Afghanistan, because that was our biggest mission for 20 years, military mission. And of course, we really need to have a lessons learned process. We organize that at NATO. I know that different allies will do the same. And we have to be honest, we have to be frank, we have to be clear-eyed, because we need to learn some serious lessons about what worked and what did not work. And I'm not ready to conclude and to give the final answers on all these aspects. So what I say now is more, what should I say, my thinking, my reflections, but I stand ready to adjust my analysis as we move forward with the lessons learned project. First, on the credibility. Sometimes I think we have to remind ourselves why we went in. We invoked Article 5 to protect the United States and all other allies against terrorist threats. That was the reason we went in. And actually, that task on that task, we achieved a lot. We degraded Al-Qaeda, and we have prevented Afghanistan being a platform where terrorist organizations can train, organize, plan, finance terrorist attacks against our own countries. That's not a small thing to achieve, it's a big thing. We have achieved that for 20 years. Now the task is to stay vigilant, be coordinated, put pressure on the Taliban regime, but also be ready to strike from distance if needed to prevent Afghanistan again becoming a safe haven. So task number one, fight international terrorism. We didn't fail, actually we achieved the goal. The challenge is to preserve that. Then we had this state-building effort. And then I think it's important to remember that was an effort not only by NATO. Actually, NATO played a minor role. It was an effort by the whole international community. The UN, the EU, individual NATO allies. I was at that time Prime Minister of Norway when we sent in development aid workers and a lot of people helped them to build state institutions, fight corruption, modernize their whole society. Well, we were not able to do that because we saw the collapse of the state institutions like that. So there are some serious lessons to be learned about nation building. But that's lessons to be learned, yeah, for NATO, but also for the whole of the rest international community who actually were more deeply involved in that part of the task than NATO. So that's a lesson learned that we need to do as EU, as UN, as individual NATO allies. And of course, NATO should be part of it, but this is much more than NATO. On that, I would say that much has been lost when it comes to democracy, rule of law, and those efforts in Afghanistan. But some of those social and economic gains have not been lost. The education that millions of people have received is still there. They can still read and write, and we should continue to do whatever we can to use support for NGOs, for private organizations to continue to provide support to education, social and economic progress in Afghanistan. Then maybe I don't fully understand, but you see, Europeans were left alone. We all helped to evacuate each other. First of all, there were many European. The evacuation, yes, it was a very, as I say, chaotic and difficult situation the first 2-3 days. But after that, it was actually quite impressive that the effort, also very much because of the United States, but also the effort by many other allies, that were able to get so many people out. UK deployed a significant number of troops, getting people out, not only British citizens, but European, and from many other countries, including Afghans. As I said, Norway was running a hospital at the airport, critical for the whole operation. NATO civilian staff were running actually the airport, helping allies out from all countries. And Turkey played also a key role at the airport. And I also know that Germany, Spain, many other countries, the Netherlands sent in planes and helped to evacuate. So for me, it was a tragedy what happened with the Taliban takeover and the lives lost at the airport. But it was a demonstration of what we can do together when North America and Europe stand together and conduct a big operation as that airlift was. So this notion that in a way someone was left alone, it's not correct. We did it together. So that's my I think it's important because I think it would be dangerous if we now start to talk as if we in a way only took out some citizens from some nations and actually took out everyone. The challenge now is the Afghans at risk. We were able to get out thousands, but there are thousands more who have supported us, worked with us over all these years. NATO allies have provided have received a lot of support from Afghans, and we need to continue. And I welcome the efforts by several allies to continue to get people out, because that's the least we owe them, is to continue to help them. Then, to try to be short, I will just answer one more aspect of this Afghan question on intelligence. I receive a lot of intelligence, and in my previous life, I received a lot of economic forecast, because then I was, as I told the Prime Minister of Norway, for instance, we studied the oil market very carefully. And I'm very impressed. All the numbers and all the figures and all the facts I can get, but still I'm not able to predict the oil price. And intelligence is a bit the same. You can get a lot of facts about the strength of the Taliban, where they are, what kind of weapon systems. You can get numbers for the Afghan security forces, but what is hard to predict is the political dynamic, what happens at the top, and the political processes at the top in the Afghan government. And we saw a rapid collapse of the political leadership in Afghanistan, and that led to the collapse of the defense of Kabul and the rest of Afghanistan. There were many brave Afghan soldiers, but without leadership, without logistics, without ammunition, fuel, the whole thing collapsed. And that was very hard to predict. Well, part of the lessons learned should be to how can we look into that, but it doesn't change the main issue. Was it right or wrong to leave? And allies agreed that the time had come to leave, and I didn't sense any, as I say, great interest among European allies to fill the void after the United States, which I fully understand, because we went in, because they are an attack on the United States. Article 5 was not invoked to protect Afghanistan, it was invoked to protect our nations. We fought terrorism, and then when the United States decided to end its military mission, then we all left after close consultations.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Footnote, we had reports that a number of Afghan military units had not received pay for 7 months. And if those reports are true, it makes you wonder, well, more than wonder, what was going on. Lots of money pouring into the central government. I don't mean that as a criticism of NATO. That if you're wondering why were people bought off by the Taliban, well, if you're not being paid for 7 months and you're a soldier on the field putting your life on the line, that might help explain it. Group number 4, Przemysław Czarnecki from Poland, Alex Sherrilbrook from the United Kingdom, and Linda Sanchez from the United States. Mr. Czarnecki. Mr. Czarnecki, are you here? What's that? He's there. He's not there. Not there. Okay. Alex.
Thank you, Mr. President. Secretary General, you quite rightly made the point that the strategic concept is more about the negotiations and build-up that come before that is published. And within that, it needs to be recognised that there is now a fundamental shift in how military allies have operated up to now. PESCO has many positive aspects to it in increasing the investment of European nations into defence procurement and the ability to operate. But it also creates a new political concept. And that potentially in the future could create a tension that may not be able to do operations if certain countries don't want to take part, which has been an acceptable part of NATO. So therefore, could I ask you about the strategy which needs to be employed leading up to the strategic concept being published to establish protocols which can easily be solved at this point to ensure that those issues do not become a problem at the time when we need to be able to move quickly?
Thank you, Alec. Linda.
Thank you, Mr. President, and Mr. Secretary General. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us this morning. NATO is a political military alliance built on a foundation of the democratic principles that are enshrined in NATO's founding treaty. But as I'm sure you're aware, we're facing growing competition from authoritarian regimes that explicitly challenge these principles. And we in the Assembly think that it's vital that the alliance take steps to bolster our own commitment to democracy individual liberty, and rule of law. And as we sadly learned on January 6th, nobody is immune from these challenges. The Assembly has proposed the creation of a Center for Democratic Resilience at NATO headquarters to monitor the health of our democracies and to provide support to allies who seek to strengthen democratic institutions. My question for you is, what is your view of the Assembly's proposal, and how can member states put this on the agenda of the new strategic concept, given that it is in line with the principles of the Brussels 2021 communique? Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Penetrating question. Mr. Secretary General.
Thank you so much. First on PESCO. My overall message is that I support EU efforts on defense, especially when it comes to developing new capabilities, as long as these capabilities, of course, are owned by the nations and are available for also NATO operations. More than 90% of the people living in the European Union, they live in a NATO country, and we have only one set of forces, and therefore we must make sure that these new capabilities are available also, of course, to NATO. But that has been stated again and again from the European Union and from all European allies that that's the case. So given that, I'm strongly in favor of PESCO and the European Defence Fund because they are tools that can help European allies to develop new capabilities, something which NATO has been asking for many years. Then, of course, we also would like to prevent those mechanisms to create new barriers between NATO allies. And therefore, in our dialogue with the European Union, we have highlighted again and again the need to really look into the details, and there are many details here, but that we ensure as far as possible that non-EU allies can be included, and that there can, for instance, develop the projects where Canada and the EU member are going together, so we don't create new barriers between NATO allies and the EU members. So I don't know if your question was about that, then my answer is that we should welcome these tools, but we should ensure that it's not duplicating or competing with or creating new barriers against those NATO allies who are not EU members. Then on the democratic, resilience coordination center. First of all, I think it is extremely important that you raise that issue. How can NATO do more to stand up for and protect our core values? Because we see that these values are under pressure and threat in some NATO allied countries. And of course, the most shocking example was what we saw the 6th of January in Washington. Because a peaceful transition of power is the core idea of any democracy. And when that is challenged, of course, that's an attack on the heart, the core of any democratic institution in any democratic country, and this was the United States, the biggest ally. But I think it was also regarded as an attack on the whole idea that NATO is based on democracy, the rule of law, and individual liberty. I also believe that the new strategic concept is a way for us to recommit, but also step up when it comes to addressing our democratic values, and we should also work on your proposal. But as you know, for that to be agreed, we need consensus. So sometimes it takes some time to get consensus, but that's for all of us and all those who are engaged to work with the member states. And then at the end of the day, it will be 30 allies that decide whether we are able to agree on this or not.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. Group number 5, we have Velazar Shalamanov, head of the Bulgarian delegation, Christian Tybran-Gedi, head of the Norwegian delegation, and Andronios Zubalas, head of the Lithuanian delegation. Belazar.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Secretary General, thank you for your leadership of the many years after 2014. That was the turning point for NATO, especially in Eastern Europe. What was achieved with not only Readiness Action Plan, but many other initiatives, but still we experience dependence in defense from Russia that is absolutely unacceptable and creates vulnerabilities. So in this context, what could we do more as alliance to cut this dependence that creates unacceptable vulnerabilities? And how could we use common funding and NATO agencies in order to improve resilience in the Black Sea region? I just want to add that in Afghanistan there are many lessons, but one positive lesson is that NATO agencies, both NSPA and NCIA, were very instrumental in supporting the efforts of NATO nations. So maybe we could use this in Eastern Europe as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Velazar. Christian.
General and dear Jens, we know each other from Norway. My question is about Taiwan and China. We've seen Chinese provocation towards Taiwan the last month as being steadily worse. And also we had the bombers going there with nuclear weapons passing through over tiny Taiwan airspace. We're talking about strategic concept. China is not waiting for a strategic concept. Taiwan is not, cannot afford to wait for a strategic concept. And strategic concept is just, it's not just talk, but it's on the paper. It's written on the paper, and it doesn't really help either of Taiwan for defending Taiwan. So my question is, what is actually NATO's role in defending Taiwan against China, and what is NATO now doing to prepare or have a contingency plan to help Taiwan in case it's going to be a military challenge there in the near future? Thank you.
Thank you. Audronius.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear Secretary General, first of all, I would like to say about so-called trust crisis to NATO. At least in my country, in Lithuania, where NATO is among the most trusted organizations, and the NATO forward troops presence are very much respected in Lithuania. But, Secretary General, discussing the alliance future, we cannot avoid the question of its enlargement. But we must admit that some NATO countries are skeptical about NATO's enlargement and often used so-called explanation that we should not provoke Russia. Secretary General, could you name advantages that alliance enlargement might bring? And how do you understand the phrase, not provoke Russia? Does it mean that Russia has a veto power to enlargement? Thank you.
Thank you, Adonis. Good questions. Mr. Secretary General.
Okay, first on Bulgaria and common funding and how to deal with a more aggressive Russia. Well, I think what we have seen since 2014 is a fundamental shift in NATO. Our resources and our efforts have actually been taken away from, or we are reduced how much we allocate to big combat operations out of NATO territory for different reasons. We have to remember that we had more than 130,000 people in Afghanistan, or troops there, not so long ago. Now we are down to 0. We have also reduced some other big operations and missions outside NATO territory. Instead, we have seen a significant build-up of collective defense in Europe. With, for the first time in our history, battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance, high readiness of our forces, tripling the size of the NATO response force, increased spending for 7 consecutive years. Also, before 2014, European allies were cutting defense budgets for years after years. Now all allies have increased defense spending for 7 years, added 260 billion extra. This is a huge reinforcement of our collective defense, the biggest since the end of the Cold War. So this is a fundamental shift. And this is about NATO's credibility, and it demonstrates our willingness to stand together and support each other. Common funding is part of that, because common funding is only a tiny fraction of total defense spending, but that is what we are spending together. That can provide key enablers, money for pre-positioned equipment, for more exercises, air defense, these kind of stuff that can bind NATO allies together and demonstrate our unity and our resolve that actually is a force multiplier. And that's the reason why heads of state and government decided at their summit that we should do more on all three budgets, the civilian budget, on the defense investment budget, and also the military budget. We'll come back to the requirements and the concrete proposals by the summit next year, but we are working on that now. Then, Christian, or Norway, you are completely right that, of course, the strategic concept, that's words. But words matters because it defines and clarifies the direction for our travel, what we want to obtain, and that is important. If we have very strong military capabilities, but not the political will to use them, then those military capabilities are useless. So we need both the capabilities, but also the resolve, the unity, and the clear direction. And the strategic concept, that helps to create that unity, which is so important for credible deterrence and defense, which is the combination of resolve and capabilities. But of course, strategic concept alone is not enough. Taiwan is not a NATO member. They will never become a NATO member. NATO is an alliance for Europe and North America. But of course, we see China, which is behaving in a more coercive way against neighbors. We see what they do in the South China Sea, also undermining the freedom of navigation, and we see also China and Russia operating more and more closely together. So all of this matters for NATO, and that's the reason why we need to invest more in technology. That's the reason why we have to work more closely with our Asia-Pacific partners, as we also decided at the summit, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. And that's the reason why we need to, for instance, invest more in our resilience of our societies. So we are doing a lot, which is about how to adapt to a world where the global balance of power is shifting and China is rising. And I'm certain that we'll continue to step up. Then on the enlargement and this idea of enlargement will provoke Russia. First of all, it is an absolutely and fundamental principle that every sovereign nation has the right to decide its own path. So whether a nation would like to become a member of NATO or not is up to that nation to decide. And of course, it is for that nation and the NATO allies to decide whether the aspirant nation meet the standards to become a NATO member. Russia has not a veto, and Russia must never get the veto, because it's about respecting the sovereignty of every nation to decide its own future. And I say this also knowing that, of course, Russia always tries to say that it's a provocation. When, for instance, the Baltic countries and Poland joined, they said that was a provocation. But I'm very glad that we had the strength in our country to say that they are welcome. And I can speak, sometimes I use my own country. When Norway joined in 1949, Norway is a border country of Russia or the Soviet Union at that time. Stalin warned heavily against. He didn't want Norway to join. But because Washington, London, Paris, all the other capitals in what was done as the founding members of NATO said, Norway is welcome, even though they border Russia and Russia don't like it. I'm very glad that that was the approach at that time. So it's for NATO allies to decide when the aspirant countries, for instance, Georgia and Ukraine, meet the NATO standards and are ready to join the alliance, no one else.
Good point. Group number 6. Zdrava Busic, acting head of the Croatian delegation, Philippe Michel Kleisbar, deputy head and acting head of the French delegation, and Athanasios Davakis, deputy head of the Greek delegation. Zdrava.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I have two questions, and I'll try to be very brief. Mr. Secretary General, as an active member of NATO, Croatia guards and promotes the values this organization stands for. Having said that, Croatia is concerned that our neighbor, Bosnia and Herzegovina, did not make much progress on her path towards NATO membership. In this vacuum, Mr. Secretary General, others are watching for the right opportunity. President of our Parliamentary Assembly, Honorable Connolly, in his address this morning said, and I'll quote, that NATO is going to go for strategic concepts, clear commitments, and for rededication of NATO for democratic transformation. Bosnia and Herzegovina badly needs all of these. Let us apply them to this country in our immediate neighborhood. Second question is about the recent developments in Kosovo and Montenegro, Montenegro being a member of NATO. How closely is NATO following these developments in this very strategic area? Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Mr. Secretary General.
Thank you, Zdrava. And you have 8 seconds left. Great job. Philippe Michel.
Mr. President. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, dear colleagues. The AUKUS context is what leads me to take the floor today. You know this context, so I won't get back to that. Let me tell you, though, that it's not about a sudden end to an industrial contract between allies. It leads to vulnerabilities. The French defense industry is performing well, and it is resistant, so it will overcome this challenge. The presidents of France and the United States have taken the floor. They have talked about the way ahead. This is now to be implemented. It is up to each of us to contribute to this way ahead, because, of course, these words spoken by allied presidents have a weight, an importance for all of us. Secretary of State Blinken has already started to implement the words uttered by the presidents. They have spoken about a stronger and more capable European defense that positively contributes to the global transatlantic security, and it is complementary to NATO. Mr. Secretary General, what divides us weakens us. Our democracies face threats in their own allied countries, and this is a source of worry. It is the same for the weakening of norms. I'm thinking here of nuclear proliferation and the non-compliance with Article 4 at several times in the past years. Don't you think that this is more important than the Europeans' will to contribute greater to their own security, their commitment towards protecting the Euro-Atlantic space? Hasn't the time now come to realize what is obvious and to fully dedicate ourselves to overcome the contemporary challenges we face?
Thank you, Philippe Michel. Athanasios.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary, with the NATO 2030 agenda, the alliance has taken important steps to leverage the power of the private sector with projects such as the Defence Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic. Cooperation with the private sector is, however, also important in another context, that of increasing our resilience against cyber attacks and cyber terrorism. What step is NATO taking? This is my question. What step is NATO taking or planning to take to assist and speed up the process of securing critical infrastructure in member states, particularly those systems controlled by private sector entities, against cyber attacks and cyber terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you, Athanasius. Mr. Secretary General.
So first, on Bosnia and Herzegovina, we strongly support their efforts to reform and modernize their country. We work with them, we provide them support. But of course, we see that there are huge challenges in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but we will continue to provide support and help. Then on Kosovo, as I said, we are absolutely present in Kosovo. We have a KFOR presence with about 3,000–4,000 NATO troops. They have been important for many years, but they continue to be important, not least now with the new agreement where KFOR, NATO, took responsibility to control some of the disputed or some of the border crossings where we had some disputes related to crossings from Serbia into Kosovo and the other way around, also from Kosovo into Serbia. And I think it also demonstrates a very good way of NATO-EU cooperation, what we achieved there, and we strongly support the continued efforts within the EU-facilitated dialogue between Pristina and Belgrade. Then on also to France. Well, also, first of all, I very much welcome the joint statement between President Biden and President Macron. I'm also absolutely confident that the allies involved in this will find a way forward. It is not the first time we have some differences between allies. We just have to prevent that this becomes a dispute or a rift in the Transatlantic alliance. I, of course, understand that France is disappointed, but we should prevent this from becoming an issue that creates a more deep and lasting rift in the relationship between allies, and especially between North America and Europe. And the AUKUS deal is not directed against Europe or NATO. It is a deal between two NATO allies, the United States and the United Kingdom, with a close partner, Australia. Again, I understand France is disappointed, but I also strongly believe that allies are agreeing, or they agree on the big picture, that we need to stand together and we need to step up our cooperation with the countries in the Asia-Pacific, like Australia. We agreed to that at the summit in June. We need to deliver on that, on maritime security, on cyber, and many other areas where we can work together with these countries. And then I think it's a responsibility for all allies that all allies, when there are differences, and there will be differences also in the future, that we try to solve them bilaterally without bringing all the difficulties into NATO, because we need to prove in the future, as we have proven over more than 7 decades, that yes, we are 30 different allies from both sides of the Atlantic with different parties, different culture, different history, but we are able to agree around the core task, standing together, North America and Europe, and I'm absolutely confident that we will be able to do that also in the future. Then Greece. Resilience, yeah, absolutely. That's one of the main messages in NATO 2030, and also some of the one of the most important decisions we made at the NATO summit was that we have to strengthen further what we call resilience guidelines, also guidelines for critical infrastructure, including cyber, to make sure that we have critical infrastructure that can operate in peace, crisis, and conflict. And we see more hybrid attacks, we see more cyber attacks. What NATO has done is to significantly strengthen our cyber defenses. We share best practices among NATO allies. We conduct big exercises, and we will continue to work together. I also believe strongly that the 5G discussion was a kind of turning point in NATO, because not so many years ago, many allies thought that 5G, that was only a commercial thing, that had nothing to do with security. We had some very frank and good discussions at NATO, and now allies have realized that 5G is actually essential for our security. And not many of them have chosen a Chinese provider of 5G networks. We have been able to find other solutions, and that demonstrates that NATO is a platform also to address these kind of threats and challenges we see related to, for instance, critical infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and we're halfway through. I want to thank you for your stamina. We have two questions in Group 7. Paolo Formentini, from Deputy Head of the Italian delegation, and Zsolt Nemet, Deputy Head of the Hungarian delegation. Paolo.
Thank you. In my personal opinion, European leaders keep stressing the importance of the transatlantic bond, but sadly, facts are different. Today, we celebrate the Italian-American heritage, remembering Grand Admiral Columbus, a true symbol of transatlantic unity. But are Europeans' public opinions still really committed to this relationship, unique link? Strategic autonomy of Europe means leaving US alone in the containment of China? Isn't it wiser to reinforce Europe inside NATO instead of duplicating NATO? Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. And Zsolt.
President, Secretary General, I would like to greet all of you colleagues in the name of the Hungarian delegation. And my question relates to the Western Balkans in general. Secretary General, there is another mission which has 20 years past, and that is the involvement of us in the stabilization of the Western Balkans, which is still going on and which might be successful. I am very proud that Hungary has just taken over the command of KFOR, and we have hundreds of Hungarian troops participating in the last 20 years in that mission. And my question is, Secretary General, do you find relevant the open door and enlargement policy in the peace and democracy and the stabilization of the Western Balkans? And if yes, how do you and what do you think about the joint statement between NATO and EU you are planning to sign in the near foreseeable future? Should it relate the enlargement and the stabilization of Western Balkans? What is your opinion about this question?
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary General.
Okay, now I start with the last one. Yes, of course, open door matters for the Western Balkans, and we have demonstrated that over the last few years. First of all, we have countries like Slovenia and Croatia. Sometimes I know they are not referring to themselves as Western Balkans, but Southeast Europe. But they have been members for many years. But over the last few years, we have actually been able to get 2 new members from the Western Balkans. That's Montenegro and North Macedonia, and that's a big achievement. That's good for these 2 countries. It's good for NATO, and it demonstrates that our door is open. NATO's door is open. It's not only something we say. We have actually been able to enlarge our alliance with new members from that region over the last few years. We will continue to work for enlargement, but as I said, to become a member, we need consensus in NATO, and we need the aspirant countries to meet the NATO standards, and we are working on that with Georgia, with Ukraine, and also with Bosnia and Herzegovina. Then on strategic autonomy and the European defence. Well, I think that part of this discussion is sometimes a bit difficult, because I think people mean different things with the same words. So, for instance, for me, I always say that I support European defence. I support European defence efforts, as long as they happen within the NATO framework. So, but other times you get the impression that a strategic autonomy or European defense with the capital E and D is something outside alternative to NATO, and that I don't support. It has been stated again and again for European leaders that they don't want to do something outside NATO. But for instance, NATO, as a precondition for any stronger European efforts on defense, is to spend more. There is no way you can get more European defense without European allies spending more. And there is one institution that has been pushing for more European defense spending for years, and that is NATO. Actually, we made a decision at the NATO summit in Wales in 2014, where we called on all European allies and Canada to step up. The good news is that after that NATO decision, European allies have started to invest more. So that's more European defense. Because when you get more money, stronger defense budgets, then you can buy more capabilities and exercise your forces more. That's stronger European defense. But not despite of NATO, but because of NATO. Because NATO was actually the organization that pushed. It was President Obama, then later President Trump, and then now President Biden, and the whole of NATO has been very clear about the need for European allies to invest more. Second, NATO has also been pushing very hard for more European efforts on capabilities. Because European allies need more high-end capabilities. Drones, planes, many other things. The challenge, I think I mentioned that for some of you before, is that there's a challenge of the fragmentation of the European defense industry. In the United States, they have many thousands of battle tanks, and they're only one type. In Europe, we have fewer battle tanks, and we have 9 different types. So the economy of scale is almost non-existent. The cost of spare parts, training, maintenance, development, all of that is much higher. So if Europe, with the European Defence Fund, with PESCO, can overcome some of the fragmentation of the European defence industry, that will be a big advantage for European defence, for NATO, for all of us. And NATO is actually trying to push for that. What we must avoid is duplication. The backbone of NATO is the command structure, and we cannot have 2 command structures. The other, and of course, the main responsibility for NATO is Article 5. We cannot have 2 collective defense clauses, because then if a NATO EU ally is attacked, then there will be big discussions whether the EU or NATO should come to rescue. That can be no doubt about that. And again, I know that this has been it's clearly not intent, but of course, EU cannot defend Europe because 80% of NATO's defense expenditure comes from non-EU allies, and you can also only look at geography. Norway and Iceland in the north, Turkey in the south, and the west, US, Canada, and UK. They are all important for the defense of Europe. So we are 30 allies, some EU members, some not, who have decided that we should protect and defend each other. And then we should do it together, not start to establish groups within that, because that will undermine the trust that 30 allies have in each other. But my main message is that I'm confident that this is not the goal, because Europe and North America, we are the most successful alliance, but then we have to stand together, and that must be the case also in the future.
There has been no putsch. The president has not been assassinated, but I've received a battlefield commission. It also leaves me with the slightly unpleasant task of announcing that Group 8 will, I fear, have to be the last group. And I apologize to those who may be disappointed. And my second piece of instruction is that we must finish by 11:50. So that imposes discipline on all of us, not least me in my introduction. So the next questions will be for Michael Zerber, Deputy Head of the Polish Delegation, Andrea Gorgia Orsini, Member of the Italian Delegation, and Ana Miguel dos Santos, member of the Portuguese delegation. Michel Serba, please.
Good morning, everybody. Mr. Secretary General, Belarus must remain a priority on the international agenda. That's why our committee has prepared a report on Belarus that will be accepted by the Assembly. The crisis in Belarus following the rigged presidential election is deepening. There are now more than 800 political prisoners. The regime has orchestrated a hijacking of a commercial Ryanair flight. At the NATO summit in June, allies stated that their deep concern about the recent developments and pledged their support for a democratic, sovereign and stable Belarus. Last month, the Lukashenko regime, likely with the support of Russia, has enhanced hybrid activities against alliance members. One of these is manufacturing a recent migrant crisis. Lukashenko has encouraged hundreds of non-Belarusian migrants to cross the border into EU territory, forcing Poland, for instance, to issue a state of emergency in a border area. Mr. Secretary General, do you agree that NATO needs to account for a broad range of contingencies to ensure credible deterrence? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that and for keeping to the speed limit. Now, Andrea Gorgo Orsini, member of the Italian delegation.
Speak in Italian. Signor Segretario Generale.
Moment.
Please. Use the headphone.
Okay.
Signor Segretario Generale.
Mr. Secretary General, I'd like to go back once again to the topic raised by my colleague, Mr. Formentini, a few minutes ago. Europe's strategic autonomy, aka European Common Defense. As you yourself were mentioning, there are a number of ambiguities, even in terms of terminology. We often use the same terms with different meanings in mind. And this creates a climate of suspicion on both sides of the Atlantic, which on the one hand leads the U.S. To seeing the idea of common European defense as an attempt to shrink from strategic cooperation within the Atlantic Alliance. And on the other hand, some European countries think that the alliance is an obstacle when it comes to Europe's desire to equip itself with a common defense structure. You were mentioning a number of reasons, including economies of scale, and therefore Europe has to work on finding a common defense structure, which has to take place within the framework of the Atlantic Alliance. So my question is, how can we overcome these political and cultural misunderstandings which have emerged on this topic? It's not just a matter of resources to allocate for our defense. I think it's a broader issue regarding how allies understand one another. Thank you.
And finally, Ana Miguel dos Santos, member of the Portuguese delegation.
Thank you, President Lord Campbell. What an honor. First of all, let me greet everyone here present, and especially to Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg to be in my country, Portugal. What an honor for us. So, at one of the most important moments of our recent history, when we all face challenges, social, economic, and health, reflecting on the organization must be a moment of rebirth for an alliance between peoples who nurture a common idea, peace. Is therefore an important moment to talk about the need to strengthen the political dimension as a way to reach consensus, but also to strengthen the organization's relationship with citizens. Intensify empathy with citizens is a way to achieve greater social acceptance. That's why I ask you, do you not consider these two dimensions, social and political, important to improve public perception and greater acceptance by citizens of NATO's mission and role? and also as a way to fight misinformation? Thank you.
Secretary General.
I can start with the last one. Also, absolutely, I think it's a very important thing to strengthen NATO as a political alliance, also to communicate what we do. And NATO has been and continue to be a military political alliance. Our main task is to preserve peace, and of course, any social progress is totally dependent on that we are able to live in peace. So there's a close connection between NATO as a military alliance and NATO as an alliance that help people to strive for a better life and to make social and economic progress. And maybe we should be better at communicating this. And again, I hope that the strategic concept process in itself can help to convey this narrative. Then there have been actually several questions about credibility and trust and so on. Of course, it varies, but we follow the public support to NATO very thoroughly, very closely. And the main picture is that throughout the alliance, there's record high support for NATO. If you ask people, will you vote in favor of leaving or in favor of staying in NATO, there is a huge majority across the whole alliance. So yes, we have problems, and yes, there are issues and differences, and something doesn't go as well as we planned. But overall message is that NATO is a strongly supported organization with high credibility, both in North America and in Europe. Then I will do Belarus. Belarus, and also the question from Poland. Well, we are of course we are monitoring what is going on there on the border between Belarus and Poland, Lithuania, Latvia. This has been addressed in NATO several times, and we also see how, in a way, the regime in Minsk, President Lukashenko, is using migrants as an instrument. And we also deployed something called some experts to Lithuania to help Lithuania to deal with and respond to what we have seen. So of course, this is something we will monitor closely as it develops and stay ready to support and work with allies most affected. Then the question about strategic autonomy. No, I think you're absolutely right that there is some ambiguity and phrases are interpreted are understood in different ways. Sometimes, if my impression is that then the president is coming. So yeah, Mr. President. Good to see you again. Yeah. Well, as I said, if this means more European spending on defense, it's not only something we are not against. We are heavily in favor. We have been pushing for that for many years. If it means more European defense capabilities, heavily in favor, pushing it for many years. But if it means to start to build a kind of alternative command structure, that will weaken NATO and actually undermine the whole backbone on a NATO, which is a command structure that gathers, rallies 30 allies together. We exercise, we operate together. If we have two half-full to half-manned command structures, that's neither good for Europe nor good for the rest of NATO. So anything that competes, overlaps, is not good. And I know that some allies, also some allies outside the EU, they are they're also afraid of the narrative. Perception matters, because we are actually 30 allies who have decided that we will protect and defend each other. And that's actually to really offering and making sacrifices in the defense of each other. And then if they get the impression that there are 22 of them who are going to kind of build their own club, that undermines that trust. And especially when the narrative is that we should go alone. I don't think the United States should not go alone. Europe should not go alone. We should go together. strategic solidarity. That's what NATO is about, that we protect each other. And anything that can undermine that perception is not good for the whole idea of standing together in a very successful alliance. You know, if this is about EU's ability to deploy some forces in some operations in Africa or somewhere else, not a problem. You already do that. But I know that some allies, they think that strategic is not about small operations. Strategic is about the big things. It sounds like the big. And actually in NATO, strategic is nuclear. So strategic is normally thought about as some of the big issues, not the small operations. And autonomy sounds like alone. So I don't know exactly what that phrase means, but I only know that some allies think that this means that someone is planning to do big things alone, without the whole alliance. I strongly believe European allies should do more, invest more capabilities, more planes, more helicopters, all of that, but not outside, but inside the NATO family. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. Listening to what you just said, I am reminded of Benjamin Franklin, one of the great American figures of the Revolutionary War. And he once said about the American colonies in revolution, he said, "We must hang together or we will most assuredly hang separately." So I think your point is very well taken. Mr. Secretary General, thank you so much for such an enlivening and enlightening willingness to listen to our concerns and answer our questions as forthrightly as you have. Your candor and your stamina and appreciation of this dynamic with parliamentarians who ultimately do determine our respective national participation in NATO is deeply appreciated. You've been a great friend, and we deeply appreciate your role, and we very much respect it, and you. Thank you for being with us again.